Our research project this year focused on the stresses that low-income communities of color experience here in Los Angeles. There is a lot of research that focuses on environmental racism and how poor communities of color are overwhelmed with liquor stores, traffic pollution, dumping sites, recycling center, gun violence, unemployment, and homelessness. However, there is new research that examines how racism and discrimination negatively affects the mental and physical health of people of color. We learned that racialized stereotypes, insult, discrimination, and environmental injustice could cause mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and addiction behaviors, like overconsumption of fast food, drugs, and alcohol. This phenomenon is called racial battle fatigue. As young people, we wanted to get a deeper understanding of the environmental and mental health stressors that affect the well-being of our communities. Our hope is that this project can lead to solutions and recommendations to improve the mental health and wellness of our communities. Check it out.
And racial microaggressions are those everyday forms of racism that we experience in the various spaces that I talked about earlier, right? I mean, you can be going to a store, a market, in the mall, and someone will treat you differently, and you'll know you feel something, right? That it's not right, and it's that everyday sort of racism that people experience. They can be subtle, but sometimes not often subtle. They can be very blatant sometimes. People can say something to you, but most often they're subtle, right? They're these subtle forms of racism, everyday racism that we experience. We call them racial microaggressions, as I said earlier in the talk, based on the work of Chester Pierce. He's the one that coined the term racial microaggressions, and so that's how we define it. These happen, as I said, subtly often. They're layered, so they could be about who you are as a Latino, or who you are as a person of color. They can also be, it can be also who you are as a young woman, who you are as an immigrant, who you are as other sort of identities that you might have. It could be, they can be based on that as well. And then they're cumulative. I mean, they happen often. They sometimes happen daily. Sometimes happen more than daily. So they're what we call cumulative, and they take their toll. They have an impact on you. So that's basically what they are, racial microaggressions. They're these everyday forms of racism that you experience that often what people will do is that they'll dismiss them, right? But what we argue is you can't dismiss them because they have an impact, and it's a cumulative impact.
You're saying a type of microaggressions, and I think an example of that is in our own schools, because they've lowered the standard in minority schools, and as a Latino student, it feels that they're trying to tell us that we're not capable of reaching certain expectations, and they don't know. They just make assumptions, and it's really disrespectful.
Art therapy is a creative therapy often used in the mental health profession, in which individuals work with an array of mediums: paint, markers, sculpting. The creative process and the final product itself is all therapeutic. It can help with a variety of outcomes, whether it be depression, anxiety, self-esteem, self-awareness, addiction, abuse, trauma, it goes on and on. Acculturation is the process that people go through having come from other host countries and adapting and learning the new ways of the new culture. Personally, I am Mexican American, so I have gone through acculturation process. As a child, I don't think I realized what was happening, and the older I got, I was able to connect with my struggles and realize that they were part of that process. That is something that's very dear to me because I went through that process, and I understand it could be very difficult Even something as rejecting my skin color. I never understood where that was coming from until I got older and I realized, well, adapting into an American culture, as a child, there were no brown or dark skinned dolls, Barbies. They were all fair skinned. So naturally, I was going to reject my skin color. I did my study on the acculturation process and the bicultural identity being recognizing as two. So Mexican American, Asian American, or whatever the case may be. I think for youth, they don't, or they may not realize what is happening until they get older. They may never realize.
There are many stressors in our community that create anxiety, tension, and strife in our community. The biggest one is poverty and not having enough money to pay the rent and you know, do what you need to do to care for your children and send your kids to college. That's the biggest stressor. But income is one of the biggest stressors. Poor neighborhoods with lots of violence in the neighborhoods are stressors, and also the availability of alcohol in those neighborhoods create a lot of stress. Parents, it's really hard for parents to even raise kids sometimes. I've done research, for example, in Huntington Park, where the parents wanted to take their kids to the park, but the park was unsafe. There were shootings there and fights and all that, so they had to keep their kids at home. Those kinds of things are real big stressors. We've also talked about acculturation. Many of us, I was born in Mexico, some of you were born in Mexico or Central America, but even if you were born here, you're still a member of two cultures. You're a member of your Latino Mexican culture, your family culture, then the outside culture, you know, being in the white Anglo culture. The messages you get from them is you have to assimilate, you have to not look the way you look, you have to not speak Spanish to succeed. You know, all those are stressors. Some people succeed in dealing with that and some don't. And some end up rejecting their culture, rejecting their family, feeling very lonely and isolated, and then may go to alcohol or drugs to deal with that loss and that conflict. That's a new area of stress in our community that we're seeing that there's a relationship between this and our health is racism and discrimination. So that's another area of stress, and we have new research that shows that as we experience you know, being treated differently or being treated wrong or not respected for who you are, that creates a lot of sense of insecurity, a sense of anger, and we're finding that it affects our health.
Mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Probably Latinas have the highest incidence of thinking about suicide and depression. So being undocumented, being isolated, maybe being pressured to have sex, being pressured to do drugs, not feel like you belong. And so a lot of our families, not that they don't want to go and get therapy, is because there's no transportation, right? Or you can do it at home. So they're called home visits. So it's not that people say, well, it's stigma, it's because my family thinks that it's for crazy people. But the reality is that it's expensive. And if you don't have Medi-Cal and if you're undocumented, you're not going to be able to see a therapist no matter even if you want to see somebody. Most of your parents may be only monolingual Spanish speakers. How many Spanish speaking therapists do you think are in South LA? Not many, right? And so who gets to be a translator? How many of you guys are translators for your families? Raise your hand. An interpreter. How many of you guys interpret for your family, right? That's hard stuff. On a good note, most of our women of color are actually going to college. They're doing a lot better than our young men are. Our young men are either ending up unemployed, in jail, or dead. And it's such a huge problem right now that it's being looked at multiple. It's a health issue. that are.
So diet is the number one cause of most of the disease, most of the mental problems. My mission is to to share my experience with raw food among working class communities of color, mostly in the East Side and South Central. And because I feel very strongly that that raw food with the intelligence of the plants helps us to decolonize our bodies from commercial food and processed food that keeps us lethargic and doesn't give us the aliveness that this type of food has. Considering that much of the junk food and processed food don't have nutrients, are zero in nutrients and high in calories, our bodies lack the aliveness that they would have if they ate what our bodies need, which is this type of food. And another thing is all the sugar that people drink with sodas, for example, or with high fructose corn syrup, that also gives you a high and then you crash. So that is really not good for your adrenal glands to be always up and down, and that creates mood problems and mental health problems. So that's why a lot of people start having depression or sadness or are passive, and they become couch potatoes because they have no energy.
So being undocumented is definitely challenging. There are a lot of barriers, there are a lot of limitations. And so not knowing how to deal with that, not knowing how to go to school, not knowing how to find a job, being undocumented is difficult if you do it on your own. So that a lot of our families live below poverty level, struggling to put food on the table, struggling to pay rent. And so for a lot of our communities, going to school isn't really a possibility. Because we have other challenges that we have to address. We're constantly being policed. There's a lot of police in our communities, a lot of ICE, deporting our families, deporting our community members. In addition to that, we don't have a lot of social services. There's a lot of things like healthcare, education, that are denied to undocumented communities. And so that is our everyday reality. Undocumented Latinos and Latinas are told that they are criminals, they are told that they're aliens, that they are told that they're deviants, that they shouldn't be here. We know that all those things are wrong. We know that all those things are coming from a negative place. Undocumented students start believing all of those things that they hear, start believing that they're criminals, that they're deviants, start thinking very negatively about themselves. Our self-esteem, our self-worth, all of that is impacted by all of the negative stigma that we hear about who undocumented communities are. And so
we need to recover the autonomy over our bodies. We're very used to giving away our power to the medical industrial complex and believing that an expert like a doctor will heal us when we know our bodies better than anybody else. So the important thing is to reconnect with our bodies, to reconnect with the intelligence of our bodies, and reconnect ourselves with the rest of nature that brings the intelligence of these plants that are the fuel, the real good fuel for our bodies. So that's why it's so important that our diet is good. And I always say that the best diet is the diet that our ancestors ate, going back to the basics before food became processed, became loaded with sugar, salt, and fat. So if your ancestors came from Mesoamerica, that's the best diet for you. Corn and squash and frijoles, and that's the best diet. Milk will not be good for you because there were no cows in America before the conquistadores arrived. So our bodies are not made to digest milk.
So the Circle Project has been organizing for about the last 1.5 to 2 years. Since then, we've partnered with community organizations within Southern California to create safe spaces. I think most importantly, we have courageous conversations. One of the first things that undocumented students are asked when they come to the Circle is, do you know why you're undocumented and why you continue to be undocumented? And a lot of people don't even know their story, their history. So that's why there's so much stigma, because we don't realize how powerful and strong and beautiful we are. being able to support on a very personal level is very impactful. Standing up for people, defending people when there's a comment, when there's being language or actions that are taken that are driven from hate towards undocumented communities. I think it's important to be an ally. I think it's important to have courageous conversations about the issue and continue to challenge people that believe the negative stereotypes of who undocumented communities are. Yes, we are all wounded people and we all carry pain. We all have the capacity to be able to heal ourselves. It's important that we find healthy ways to be able to do that.
Solutions. I want to say that solution starts with you, each of you, starts with us. And we need counseling from people like us. So I need you to go to college and become therapists, family therapists, so you can help families with this issue. And then there's a community solution, an advocacy solution. I mean, you have that power. You can say, I don't want another billboard of advertising Coors in my community. Whatever you want to do, you can advocate for change. You can say, we need rehab centers. We need centers, shelters, where individuals in our communities, our families can get help, so they can come back to us and be, supportive members of our families and our communities.
So I think any project can really be used. I think mandalas are a good meditation exercise for anyone to use. My ideal would to be like a mobile art therapist where I offer my services mobily. But I'm just really passionate about the community that I live in, whether that be right now San Fernando Valley, or if I move to a different part of LA, I would want to empower and work with that community. In the end, it was like that, how their struggles were actually a beautiful thing, and how their struggles have allowed them to grow and to look at the positive things and not be held down by those struggles or by the pressure or by the racism or discrimination that people go through.
There are models and curriculums that they use. I've heard today that they want to start to bring in a curriculum where the teachers will be part of their curriculum, where their teaching will be on mental health. Can you believe that? You'll be in your classroom and one of the subject matters will be on wellness and on mental health.
And so the last part of this has to do with the response. How do we respond to these? How do we take action against them? And I think that what we've been arguing is that we do it in various ways. We respond in various ways. But the first thing, as I said earlier, is that you have to at least acknowledge that they exist. You have to recognize that they exist. And then you have to take action based on that existence. And some of the actions we take is that we push back. If we experience a racial microaggression, we respond. But as you heard in one of the tables here, sometimes the sort of the quick response may not be the best response. Sometimes you might reflect and then decide what would be the best way to respond to this everyday form of racism. And so, but sometimes I would argue, I mean, I may disagree with Grace Carroll on this, sometimes the initial response might be the best response, might be the most important response. So sometimes people have to hear how you're feeling and how you're responding to everyday racism. And so I would argue that it's all contextual. It depends on the context, right? So some people join organizations as a response to these everyday forms of racism. I'm not sure if at West Adams you have a student organization where you're able to sit down and talk about these things or engage around some of these issues. That's always a positive space to find these safe spaces, these safe havens, these what we call counter spaces to deal with the everyday forms of racism.
Our research findings indicated that the highest rate of potential racial battle fatigue can occur within our undocumented communities. It's critical that we continue to raise awareness about how racial battle fatigue and environmental stressors affect the mental health and wellness of our communities. Our research got us to think about the difference between having the privilege of living versus barely surviving. We feel that living is when people live in a neighborhood in which they are not overrun with stressors, but have an opportunity to be happy about their lives and surroundings. Daily, our communities are in a struggle against racism and environmental injustice. They are fighting and sacrificing their health and well-being to ensure that their families have a good home, healthy food, and a quality education for their children. We need more community centers for mental health and wellness in our community so that we all have an equal chance to enjoy life.